Let's go ahead and talk about AC versus DC coupling. Really, this is going to be a comparison about what the right system is depending on what the customer's needs are. If you joined us for the last webinar or you've already viewed the previous recording of the previous webinar with self-consumption, there are going to be some parallels between the two because we are talking about bringing batteries in either the first time or in a retrofit style system. So there are a lot of parallels, admittedly, between these two presentations, but well worth your time to attend and take some time to think and learn about what the differences are between the two. So what we're going to really be covering over the next hour or so is just kind of how those different solutions come together. When talking about a straight grid tie inverter, or we're talking about a battery-based inverter from Schneider, being the XW Plus or the Connext SW. What is AC and DC coupling? Just talking about where the power is coming from. If you think about it, all systems kind of are DC coupled, but where that conversion into AC, and in particular when talking about where the batteries are located, either on the AC side and they're charging from an AC source like a grid-tied system, or the batteries are being charged from the DC side with a solar charge controller. I will also talk about just understanding losses, some reminders about when system sizing, especially if the energy is going to be used more than just as a backup system. Then, there are some losses that have to be taken into account. If it is a straight backup system, really it's just about determining the loads, because it's going to be more about that these batteries are sitting locked and loaded waiting to be used versus being used on a daily basis. But if the goal is eventually for the customer to go and start using that energy storage on site sometime in the future because of time of use, or just changes in laws in the local jurisdiction that says, hey, you know what, you're not selling back anymore. You need to consume on site. Any extra energy isn't going to be a financially viable option for you. We may only pay you 1 or 2 cents, whereas before we were paying you 15, 20, 50 cents a kilowatt hour. And so consuming on site, especially if those costs also match the costs of what it is to buy power during certain times of the day, suddenly using energy storage in that capacity becomes quite important. So again, we just want to make sure that we cover what those customers' needs are and how we can fulfill them. And then just the general principles exactly of what AC or DC coupling is. And ultimately pulling the plug on the grid may be some people's goal, which is kind of why I put this photo here. So let's go ahead and jump into it and just look at what we've got and what that system's capable of doing for a straight grid tie system. So a very standard grid tie inverter. Here we have a Schneider product as an example. The array comes in through that inverter and steps it from DC into AC, and then on out to the main panel and then onto the grid. Though there may be a supply side tap here instead, and so we'd kind of be going around the main service panel. Typically what we'd see here is a meter that would sit between the grid tie inverter and the service panel, and of course the home would still maintain its grid meter. So when we look at putting the pieces together for a grid tied with battery backup system, this is a great example where the XW Plus here is charging or discharging the batteries. And then we've got a MPPT 60 charge controller. So the array provides power to the charge controller, which then puts power onto the batteries. We always want to make sure that the batteries are taken care of first because that is a consumable item. And so then once the batteries are taken care of, and the XW Plus has some neat ways of getting the selling started sooner, especially when talking to another Schneider product. And then after that, the power is either going to go out to the grid and be sold, or if it were, say, you're going to have a horrible weather day and oh no, we lost power, what are we going to do? And so here we have our backup loads from the microwave, TV, fridge, freezer, lights. One thing that I like to include is the idea that if the house is heated or the water's heated with gas, typically gas services are not interrupted during a power outage. So one thing that is definitely worth looking into to add on to the system would be the furnace as well as the hot water tank heater if they're run by gas, because the power consumption for those is fairly minimal when we're not using electricity to generate heat. Not a good idea in general to try to heat hot water or heat a house with electricity during a power outage. You're suddenly looking at a very, very large battery bank. With a typical AC coupling retrofit, with the system we see the grid tie inverter there, and probably the most important thing to note on this system is that the sub panel is being shared by the XW Plus inverter as well as the grid tie inverter. So during normal operation that we're selling power out to the grid, the XW is literally just a piece of wire. It's in a pass-through mode, so the grid tie inverter is just simply passing through the inverter onto the main panel and then out to the grid in this example. But then during a power outage, we'll see that, oh, the system just went down. What are we going to do? The XW Plus is going to continue to provide that AC signal, and the grid tie inverter is going to say, oh, there's an AC sine wave. I'm going to inject current onto it. And so the nice thing with an AC coupling retrofit is that the customer can still charge batteries, maintain loads, all on that sub panel, which is being shared by that grid tie inverter along with the XW Plus. Just to simply recap what we've kind of covered a little bit already, with residential backup in a DC coupled solar system, this is a very basic system where somebody who has frequent power outages or just simply wants to not connect to the grid as often or at all because of jurisdictional reasons, like places in Hawaii, or financially just doesn't make sense. Examples of Arizona or even Nevada come to mind. And so in this example, we see that we have an MPPT80 charge controller from the array down to a pair of XW pluses into the power distribution panel. From that power distribution panel, we can land our conductors for the grid, for the batteries, and for the backup power to the home. There would be another, for that home symbol, there would be another little box there that is your critical load panel. In some places, let's say in Australia, they only have a 50 amp panel. And so it's very reasonable to think that putting the entire home onto the output of the inverter could be done. But again, there are some risks that come with doing something like that because there are potentially some very large loads that could be on there that the customer may not be aware of during a power outage. Just because you have an event doesn't mean event being like a big storm or something like that. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to lose power, but you should be aware that those large loads, even at 50 amps, you think about what 50 amps is kilowatt wise, that's a very, very large system. So at 230 volts, 50 amps, we're talking about over 12 kW. And so that's why you'd have a pair of inverters in this example to cover all the loads inside the home. But then think about, not that we always have 50 amp loads, but let's say we had half of that, 25 amp loads at 230 volts. Suddenly that's a very large amount of power being consumed off of that system. So the question is the customer really interested in investing in that large of a battery bank to cover those loads for whatever their expectation is? With the basic building blocks of an AC coupled solution, again, I just want to maybe show a little bit more simplified diagram of exactly why that grid tie inverter gets connected to the output of the XW Plus, or in this case, we're showing the XW Plus or the Connext SW. The current that is provided from the grid tie inverter needs to have an AC signal. The grid tie inverters do not actually have the capacity of creating a sine wave. So they kind of ride the wave like a surfer, pushing power onto that sine wave. So without a sine wave, you get nothing. And so it's dependent upon that to wake it up. And in this case, during a power outage, then the grid tied system is going to see the pure sine wave coming from either the SW or the XW Plus and provide power to the to the home and to charge batteries. The other really nice thing with this system is that we can set it up so that once the batteries are charged, if it's a nice sunny day and we're just not consuming the power that's on site, then that grid tie inverter can start experiencing a frequency shift. And this is actually done on purpose by the XW Plus. So as the voltage on the battery starts to rise, what's going to happen is the XW Plus is actually going to start shifting its phase from, say, 60 hertz to 60.1, 60.2, up to 60.5 hertz. And at that point, we're outside the parameters for the grid tie inverter, and it's going to kick out, which is fine. It's not really going to hurt it. It's really made to do that, to stop producing power when the frequency gets beyond a certain range. But this guarantees that the investment that we've done in the batteries doesn't get harmed by accidentally overcharging them. Without this sort of feature in there, the excess power would continue to drive the battery voltage all the way up to the high battery cutout of the XW Plus or the SW. And what's going to happen is most batteries are not made to handle the highest voltage that the inverter does before it cuts itself out to protect itself. So using the phase shifting programming within the XW Plus allows us to do that phase shifting and kick it out before any harm comes to the system. There are some special examples of when AC coupling can help overcome some difficult issues with distance in particular. So the thing to note is that, say, the MPPT-80 charge controller goes up to 600 volts. So for most examples, doing a DC coupled system when you have long distances to shoot can be overcome by using the small conductors that are available at, say, 550 volts on at 80 amps. But if the distance is even greater than that, then we need to start thinking about how we can leverage transformers to step up and then step down voltage. In this example, this is an AC coupled solution that actually the AC coupling is done down at the home where the batteries are, but the grid tie inverter is actually up at the array on the top of a mountain. And so this customer had shot a distance of over 3 miles using a step-up transformer. So they stepped up to about 3,500 volts, and then they shot the distance with another step-down transformer. And the cost compared to running copper over these distances was astronomical. So they went with aluminum, and they were able to basically run their own little power lines from their ideal spot, which is up above in the valley, down to the house that was in the valley. And so if you have extreme shading issues and you've got to put the array at a great distance, financially this ended up making more sense than trying to run big copper at even 500 volts. It wasn't going to be a possibility. So again, we had a grid tie inverter at the top, a step-up transformer to about 3,500 volts, shot that distance, and then we had a step-down transformer at the other end. That then the AC coupled portion with the XW Plus inverter or batteries and just power distribution was all done down at the home. So it was really nice to have an outdoor rated grid tie inverter up there, and then we just simply had a power shed down below that took all that power, stepped it down, and was usable inside the home. Really, really nice way to do this configuration. Typically, here's where we would pause for some questions, but I do want us to take a moment to talk about the system that Schneider participated in, doing the controls, electronics, and just in general, the energy consumed on site is controlled by the Schneider electric product line, well and beyond just the solar side, but also fine controls and monitoring. But this is a system that was installed up on a mountaintop at Mont Blanc, which is the tallest mountain in the Alps and a very common hiking area. And unfortunately, it's a very popular area, and unfortunately there are some deaths that occur and injuries that occur. And so this way station along the way is a place for people to pause before beginning their final ascent, and well worth going out and Googling the refugee site there at Mont Blanc through Schneider Electric, and just learning a little bit more about it. A really interesting story about integrating a lot of really neat technologies from Schneider Electric into a complete system. Arguably, this system is independent enough it could be on a different planet, and Schneider's participating in making sure that all the power management and even recycling of gray water and everything else is controlled by them. So a really neat story, well worth noting down and taking a look at. So understanding your power efficiency and understanding the losses that occur within a system is really where the rubber hits the road for proper sizing. And oftentimes, if you miss one thing, then overall the system is at risk to harm, because either wire sizing isn't correct, or the amount of solar put on site isn't going to meet the needs for the customer, or the battery bank isn't large enough and doesn't meet the needs for a return on investment from the system, either it being a grid-tied battery-based system where it's just a backup system, or AC coupling where again it's just a backup system, or with the potential of doing some self-consumption on site. So with basic calculations, with panels, you don't always get what you paid for or what you see on that little sticker on the back of the panel. And so in this example, we're showing about a 25% loss, and I've been doing this for about 5 years, and that's a very fair number when speaking on average to people from San Diego, Texas, through the Southeast, up through Maine, Vermont, even the Midwest, and especially here in Washington State. I've mentioned my personal system, so I've got a 10 kW array, and typically I'll see 7.2 to 7.8 kW, even on a nice summer's day where it's maybe 80 degrees Fahrenheit outside. You just don't get what you expect if you were to take the nameplate rating, which is really those standard test conditions where the panels are kept cool and the lighting is perfect. Beyond that, of course, we have to understand that the inverter consumes a little bit of power on its own during that conversion process from energy stored DC to AC. And so something definitely that it needs to be taken into account when doing the calculations. If, for example, though, you're trying to do an AC coupled system and understanding where that power is going during the daytime versus the nighttime, we'll jump a little bit into that, but it could be that 98% efficiency off of the grid tie inverter is the number that you would end up looking at if primary consumption's during that time. Of course, battery efficiency, if it's a straight backup system, not as big a deal unless the customer's saying, when I lose power, I always lose it for a week. I only lose it a few times a year, but when I do, I lose it for a great period of time. So sizing then becomes important on that part. If it is a self-consumption where you're using the batteries frequently, so in places like Africa or down in the Caribbean area where power may be slightly unreliable to greatly unreliable, then those batteries are cycling on a frequency basis that says they need to be charged back up all the way. And so taking battery efficiency into account and making sure that we have enough of a charging source, either from the grid, a generator, or from the array itself, needs to be taken into account. Finally, with charge controllers, of course, they're very similar in efficiency to what a grid tie inverter would be. So 98% for the MPT60 or MPPT80. And then finally, of course, that 2% that we're trying to keep under, actually, for a grid tied system or for an off-grid system when running our conductors, or even a grid tied with battery backup system. We need to take into account battery length cables as well as just AC conductor lengths. It can surprise you when you start making a bunch of bends and going around corners and things like that. That distance can become quite a bit further than maybe just at first glance a less experienced person could expect. So upsizing and going with larger gauge wires to reduce that loss through conductor lengths is important. So how does it all end up at the end of the day? So total losses for a DC coupled system, when including the PV, because we're doing a total system sizing practice, total losses end up being about 48%. And this is in a cycling application. So if we took the batteries out for charging, which could be anywhere between 15% for floodeds, 5% for lithium or other technologies. And so really what we want to show here is that there are some losses along the way. So if we did do a Schneider MPPT80 charge controller along with the XW Plus, we'd take 25% for the PV, 2% for the solar charge controllers, and then 9% for the inverter making that conversion. So it doesn't matter if the inverter is discharging the batteries or just converting available DC power off of the array through the charge controller. We're going to lose about 9% there, maybe a little bit less, just depending on voltage. And then finally, of course, we already just talked about wiring, but it is important to leave that number in there with that total loss of about 48%. When we get over to total losses for AC coupled system, this is kind of assuming that we've got a cycling battery application. If we don't, and really the customer, let's say, has just a feed-in tariff and net metering set up with their system, the nice thing is that with an AC coupled solution, we're talking about 98% efficiency. And so we're really not going to lose a lot. Where the losses for AC coupled comes in is when we start cycling the batteries, and we have that extended power outage we talked about in the previous slide, where the customer says, you know what, when I lose power, I lose it for several days. And so that becomes important to understand that for sizing, just regular, what is my return on investment with the feed-in tariff and the net metering? Well, it's 98% because the XW essentially is a piece of wire, or the XW Plus is a piece of wire at that point, and nothing to be concerned about. Really, floating batteries maybe costs a kilowatt hour a day, maybe, especially if they're maybe aged batteries that need a little bit of extra to keep them up at their ideal voltage. But good long-term storage batteries with an AC coupled solution is a really nice way of having that battery-based backup system ready to go, but isn't going to affect that return on investment for just a straight net metering and, say, feed-in tariff program. So let's start looking at just how a home uses power typically in the daytime. A lot of you that are already familiar with sizing systems are going to see that typically in the morning everybody gets up, the coffee maker comes on, people start taking showers, the hot water tank kicks on if it's electric. This is a primary time for consuming power. And then of course everybody goes off to work or school, and the house is essentially empty except for, maybe there's a pet there, and we'll touch on that in a second. But then everybody starts to come home, and when they come home, then the power consumption starts to go up radically. And typically the dinner time hour is when power is consumed the most. So you're frosting for some chicken, you got the stove going to cook the chicken, you got some pasta boiling on the top, people are at home checking their email, kids are downstairs playing on a video game, let's say, lights are on inside the house. And so primary consumption tends to be from typically around 5:30, 6 o'clock until about 9 or 10 o'clock when you see the power consumption drop off there, and there's just a few loads that are left on in the house, as maybe one person's watching TV or something like that. So a very typical home in North America on how power gets consumed. But let's go ahead and look at what happens when we add one of the largest loads inside of a home, especially down in the more southern regions of the world, or more equatorial regions of the home. So here we can see that we've got a load profile that now has something very large in the middle of it, and that's air conditioning. So if the primary consumption during the daytime is actually the air conditioner, and the air conditioner, if we were to add up everything, equals almost all of the other loads inside the home, there are a couple of different ways to approach or attack this for consumption. In particular, it could be that a grid-tied system is a more efficient way of doing it over the long run. So we're not talking about 2 or 3 years, we're talking about 10, 15, 20 years, that with daytime air conditioning that's very consistent, that we're going to be able to offset that more. So is there a big difference between a grid-tied system and a battery-based system? Yeah, there could be. That 98% efficiency versus, say, 85% efficiency for a battery-based system could come into account here. The thing to note, though, is that with a battery-based system, the efficiency is much, much better. than a grid-tied system when the power goes out. And so that's where AC coupling comes into effect. So if the loads are air conditioning and that's the primary load throughout the day, then doing a grid-tied AC coupling solution where the energy storage is going to be leveraged during a power outage and charging the batteries can be done during a power outage. But really that 9 extra percent or 11 extra percent that we're going to get out of a grid-tied system suddenly makes a lot of sense. So understand the needs of the customer, especially if it's a business where kind of the loads are more of a bell curve and main power is consumed during daylight hours, then suddenly it may make more sense that grid-tied and AC coupled solution again gives you that long-term investment and that return on that investment over the long haul. And I'm saying along a lot because it's a long time before those numbers start to add up, but they do add up over time. So some of the calculations that we've shown so far could be a surprise to some installers or people who aren't initiated into grid tie or grid tie with battery backup. And it's just kind of the nature of the course when working with these systems that the typical efficiencies are well within the standard parameters of just about any other system. But from panels to battery efficiency to inverter efficiency, they just start to add up along with wiring. So probably the most important thing to take from this particular slide is that understanding when the energy is going to be used is perhaps the most important part, and then also hearing what the customer is looking to use the system for. So with battery efficiencies removed out of the equation, DC coupling becomes a little more palatable, if you will. And this is assuming, of course, that we're in a cycling application. And with AC coupling, this is assuming that we're using the efficiency of the grid tie inverter when the sun is shining. So as little as 4%. With a grid tie inverter and the wiring losses in there, that's where we get that 4%. For non-cycling applications with battery backup, it really comes down to when you're going to use that system and what the customer's looking for. So if they are looking for just offsetting a power bill with, let's say, net metering and that's it, well, great. But if they are looking for something that they want to have backup power and they want to be able to have some versatility for now and into the future, then doing DC coupling from the beginning, I would argue, makes the most sense. But there is always, of course, that option for AC coupling later on. Again, to reiterate some of the points that we've already made about the cost of the system and which way to start in the beginning, it's worth noting once more that typically a DC coupled system is going to have the best cost to benefit ratio, if you will, partially because of here in North America, of course, we have our 30% tax rebate. And so being able to incorporate the batteries into that initial cost is going to have a huge impact on the overall cost of the system. When we talk about which product from Schneider, if it's the Connext SW or the XW Plus, then we have to look at kind of when we're going to be using it. So one thing to note is that the Connext SW is not a grid tie inverter, but is a really nice inverter for, say, a small system of 3 to 4 kW of solar, and you need to AC couple to that. So that's really where the SW shines, and cost per watt is very, very reasonable. With the XW Plus, of course, you can do the whole AC coupling or do grid tie with battery backup from the very beginning. And again, this makes the most sense. When we talk about what the right amount of energy storage is for AC coupling or even grid tie with battery backup, that is going to be around 440 amp hours is our recommendation for the XW Plus. And the SW just simply because in general it's a smaller system that it's going to be attached to. So it ends up being a little bit smaller number at 200 amp hours. So here's something that's definitely worth considering when we're sizing out for a grid tie with battery backup system. So the customer's chosen something that is going to be normally selling power back to the grid. And so when speaking with the customer about how often they're losing power, this may be a really important question at the end of the day, simply because most of the time when we're sizing out batteries, we size for 50% depth of discharge, or if it's self-consumption, it may be 25% depth of discharge. But the thing to note with grid tie with battery backup is they're going to be connected to the grid 99.5, 99.6, maybe even higher percentage. Their power outages could just be once or twice a year. And so when sizing those batteries, even if the recommendation is, oh, don't go below 50% depth of discharge, what I'm arguing is that the batteries will actually age out before they cycled out, even if we did a depth of discharge of 100%. Just simply looking at the numbers from manufacturers, typically we can see 3 or 4, maybe 500 cycles out of 100% depth of discharge on a set of batteries. So if they're only losing power a couple times a year for 24 or even 48 hours, that's only 4 cycles a year. So if we multiply that out by the life of the batteries are going to literally age out. The chemicals inside are going to not be available to the system because of just natural aging process within those batteries. So definitely consider that if the size of the system says, gosh, no longer do we need to think about it as 50% depth of discharge, but 100% depth of discharge. As long as we're over that kind of 440 amp hours for the XW Plus or 200 amp hours for the Connex SW, then that suddenly starts to make more financial sense to the customer and could get you to convince them to start with a battery-based system with just the overall cost and getting the most of the return on investment out of that system. There are exceptions, of course, when sizing out for lead acids versus some of the more progressive technologies, including lithium and things like that. They're sizing out for nearly 100% depth of discharge from the start. So you can definitely take that into account. When it comes to a retrofit for AC coupling, or just even if there's a good reason, like we've discussed before, about bringing in a AC coupling solution for different reasons, the thing to note is that we don't recommend through Schneider Electric choosing to use a lithium battery bank with AC coupling. In essence, this is because it's an uncontrolled charge that's coming from the AC side. So you have the solar array coming into that grid tie inverter, and it's pushing power either onto the loads or basically backwards through the inverter onto the batteries. With a lithium-based solution, the battery management system may or may not like this sort of uncontrolled charge. And if the voltage starts to rise above and beyond its parameters, then what's going to happen is the BMS system may shut down. Along with this, typically there's kind of a fail-safe, and when that shutdown occurs, that relay is going to open up on the battery management system. And in the long run, this is going to wear that relay out. One other thing to note with salt batteries, such as with Aqueon batteries, I do understand that some of the technology has been evolving with Aqueon, but something worth checking with the manufacturer is once the batteries have gotten to a lower discharge point and we have a low battery cutout, what's going to happen is that system's going to continue to discharge down. Whereas with AC coupling, of course, the low battery cutout for the inverter stops creating that AC signal, and so the grid tie inverter is not going to produce any AC. Conversely, if we had a DC coupled system, that charge controller can fall well below or follow down that voltage below the low battery cutout of the inverter and will go quite low. But when the sun comes around the next day and we get into a charging parameter, that charge controller is very likely still going to be awake and start charging those batteries, which will then kick the inverter back on. So just some things to note about when we're bringing in energy storage into the system, making sure that we're choosing the right technology for what we're trying to do. One of the things that I enjoy about creating webinars, of course, is looking for a few fun pictures to just kind of keep the audience going. This one was a little bit of a search on proper wiring, and the question came up about what the strongest wiring practice was. Of course, this is a solid core wire, but just shows kind of how wire can be spliced together per NASA's recommendations. And so you cross it over and then you twist it around and solder it. And so this is a very mechanically and physically strong soldering connection as well as plenty of surface area, so that this isn't the weakest point within the system. Just something that's very interesting and I enjoy. So we're going to start talking about wiring and just getting into what some of the options are when we talk about AC versus DC coupling and what Schneider has to offer for making things a little bit easier with bringing that total solution together. When looking at the basic building blocks for an AC coupled solution, you do want to check with the manufacturer of the inverter to make sure that it is compatible with frequency shifting. But one of the nice things about the XW Plus is that with frequency shifting, it will finally kick out at 60.5 hertz. But ideally, an inverter will actually listen to the frequency shift and actually diminish its output so that we get more of a controlled charge based on loads and as well as whether or not the batteries need any charging or whatnot. For the XW Plus's system, we have a couple of things that you'll need to make sure that you have. You have the sub panel, which is just a commercial over-the-counter, say 100 amp or even 50 amp panel. And this is where you're going to put your critical loads. With the power distribution panel, or the PDP, that's going to be where your DC and AC come in on the right-hand side of the inverter. And then there's a small conduit box, which we can see there on the lower right side. It's the smaller box there below. And what that does is just allow you to properly run all your conduit and without any mess. And then finally, the system control panel or the COM box is what you're going to use to actually program it up. It's always recommended to at least have the system control panel and then also bring the COM box on if you'd like to have some connection and be able to monitor and review that system through the internet. So here's an example of just what a dual inverter system with the XW Plus would look like. The nice thing with the Schneider product line is we can use two of those conduit boxes underneath to help us manage the wiring, and that's going to just go up into the power distribution panel, or PDP, to the variety of breakers that we have up there. You can see that gold plate there in the background, and that represents the DC busing. So this makes things pretty darn easy to bring 1, 2, or 3 of the XW Pluses into a single power distribution panel, and keeps things pretty neat when you're putting the whole thing together. So again, this time with an SW, things are fairly similar, which is nice with the Schneider product line, that both the XW Plus and the Connext SW share some basic building blocks and basic principles. So again, to remind you, with the SMA, Solar Edge, or Enphase, make sure that you reach out to the manufacturer to make sure that the inverter has frequency shifting, so that we don't run into a situation where we may accidentally overcharge the batteries. That would not be good. With the SW inverter system, of course, we have the basic SW along with the sub panel, which again is just a standard off-the-shelf, say square D 100 amp commercial panel. The DC switchgear is pre-wired with the disconnect breakers in there already, which is really quite nice. And then we have our AC switchgear, which includes that bypass. So you can see there the SW with switchgear and the SEP there at the top. That big box there on the left-hand side has the DC disconnects for the batteries as well as PV. And then down below with that AC combiner box, we can see that little rocker switch there on the right-hand side. That's the IOB kit, which keeps the input and output bypassed in case you need to work on the inverter, but still need to have the loads powered in the distribution panel going. Only for AC coupling, what we're talking about there is that the Connext SW is not a grid tie inverter, so it doesn't really have that option later on to become a battery-based grid tie inverter. But that's why this makes a lot of sense just for AC coupling. It is a less expensive option, but will still produce that pure sine wave that you need to use with a grid tie inverter to get it to wake up during a power outage. So a great retrofit to a system that is cost conscious. One of the common questions that we get is whether or not you can do AC and DC coupling together, meaning that we're to have two charging sources. One is the grid tie inverters producing power from an array, and then let's say a wind turbine, solar, something on the DC side. We don't recommend that at this time. A lot of it has to do with managing who's charging and when, and that can create some issues within the system that we can overdrive batteries and cause something we call thermal runaway, which is unfortunately this photo that we see here on the right. So it is something that we want to strongly press you towards, with that idea that doing an AC and DC coupled system together is not a great idea, and we don't recommend it. If you do decide to add more solar at some point in the future, or want to do a battery-based system, again, to requalify for that tax credit, you do need to bring more solar in. And so definitely check with a tax expert, but you can't do it without doing solar. So if the customer is looking at doing a battery retrofit, the upside is that a little more AC coupling is going to be fine, and just make sure that you're sizing the inverter for that upsized system. So really, we're getting close to the end here. We have just a couple more slides left, and let's go ahead and talk a little bit about making sure that we understand our loads. So really, this is in general a customer-facing solution. We need to find and help the customer provide powers during a power outage or inconsistent power. So system sizing, of course, is going to be critical to understand exactly what needs to go into the system. And as we already talked about a little bit, and just as a reminder, of course, the fridge, freezer, lights, and TV are very important. Gas heating can also be worked into it, along with things like well pumps and items that are really critical to the home so that people can live in them. So, when talking to a customer, asking customers about questions, an easy way to do it is what can you not live without? And I know that sometimes that can be a very general idea, but when you think about what the customer is using on a daily basis, maybe that's not the best question. Maybe the best question is what do you need to stay in the home, or what loads need to be powered for you to be able to stay in the home for an extended period of time? Might be a nice way of asking than saying, what is the thing you can't live without? Well, I can't live without my toaster oven. Well, but does that keep you from staying in the home? Probably not. So the other idea that I've been kind of talking about a little bit in my travels is that kind of good, better, best solution. And when we talk about that, it's about sizing for the battery bank. Of course, we recommend with the XW Plus 440 amp hours and the Connext SW 200 amp hour battery bank at minimum. And so when talking to the customer about the good, better, best solution, this is about talking about the size of the energy storage and just what the system is capable of doing. Of course, good is a system that's going to meet their absolute minimum requirements, 440 amp hours, a couple of lights here and there, but for the most part, that's going to get them through a 12 to 24-hour power outage. Better is kind of the direction we want to try to steer that customer, where we've got enough energy storage for them to make it through, even if limping a little bit, with a poor insulation day after a storm or after a power outage. And of course, best is sky's the limit. Let's talk about what it would be like if you lived off grid, or what it would be like if later you wanted to do self-consumption. So the best solution is always one that has an eye towards the future, and really that just depends on where you see your state, your jurisdiction, your country going, and making sure that the customer's best set up not only for today, but for the future as well. So this is just an example again of the good, better, best, and here we have a little lithium solution with the Connext SW along with an MPPT 80 charge controller. So with a good, better, best example, 12 hours of backup is kind of the minimum amount. Of course, if we're using an AGM or flooded lead acid batteries, we do need to take the discharge rate into account, because we'll find that most batteries are sized off of a 20-hour discharge rate. And if we size those batteries out to, say, like we talked about before, 100% depth of discharge, And the customer's like, well, I really only need about 12 hours, and hopefully that'll get us through the day, but the charge controller will pick it up. We can live without lights for a little while kind of idea. Then the discharge rate could actually be a C12 rate, which will reduce that capacity. So make sure that when you're sizing that system, check out the spec sheets, reach out to the manufacturer, especially again with AGMs or floodeds, to make sure that we have the right amount of storage there based on that discharge rate. And again, of course, 24-hour backup is kind of the ideal. For me personally, I have 660 amp hours, and we have 5 people in our home. And when we've had power outages here, we've used about half of that capacity. The batteries that I have a very long float life, so it really is just a grid tie system with some battery backup attached. But that's kind of 5 people, fridge, freezer, lights, home kind of consumption. As a very general ballpark idea. Of course, if we can do 48 hours of backup, then the life of the batteries and how far we're dipping into those batteries is reduced. And really that's the best solution when we start looking at what we can do with it in the future. If you haven't had a chance, please check out the self-consumption webinar that I did not too long ago, and that will walk you through exactly why a 48-hour backup could be a really interesting idea, because then the average depth of discharge is be somewhere around 25% for consumption, because we're assuming that the sun's going to be shining for part of the day. And there's some really interesting ways of leveraging that on site now or sometime into the future, especially when considering a long-term battery. So thank everybody for joining this presentation. Feel free again to check back often. We'll be producing more of these videos, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and we'd be happy to help out. Distribution through North America or international is probably one of the best ways, and check out the Schneider-Electric.
Hello. Today I am doing a video with audio comparison of 2 home studio microphones in the $100 to $130 price range. The first microphone is the Audio-Technica AT2020 USB, not the Plus version. I think it goes for approximately $100, give or take. And the Blue Yeti, it goes for slightly more. It is also USB, and it has some features that the AT2020 does not. I'll be playing some acoustic guitar and singing. Before we do that, let's take a closer look at the 2 microphones. The first microphone is the Audio-Technica AT2020. It is slighter in build. I'm not sure that's necessarily a disadvantage. It's probably the diaphragm inside that really makes the difference. The stand is also slighter, and that does have a disadvantage with it. If you do not line up the microphone with one of the legs, so that the microphone is sitting directly over at least one of the legs, then the microphone will topple forward. So make sure when you're setting that up that you have one of the 3 legs that are rather spidery underneath. The Blue Icicles stand is very, very sturdy and robust, and indeed the Yeti seems to be a very sturdy and robust microphone as well. Also, there are some features that are not found on the AT&T. This one here is volume. So you can plug a headphone into the microphone. You plug your USB into your laptop, and whether you're using GarageBand or whatnot, if you have existing tracks, they will come out on your headphone with this volume, which will adjust a mix for you, as well as what you're playing currently. So it gives you the feature of automatically doing a 0 latency mix for you, as well as letting you hear what you play. That's an advantage to me. On the back as well, there's a couple of features. This bottom dial lets you choose your pattern. You can have bidirectional, cardioide, omnidirectional, or stereo. I've done cardio, since the AT&T is cardio, so that we're comparing apples with apples essentially, as well as a gain, so that you can adjust how strongly it's picking up the signal. Alright, so there's our 2 microphones, and we will go ahead and start the sound. Ain't no use to sit and wonder why, if you don't know by now. sit and wonder why that'd never do somehow. And your rooster crows at the crack of dawn. Look out your window, 'cause baby I'll be gone. You're the reason that I'm a-traveling on. But don't you think twice, it's alright. And there ain't no use calling out my name like you never done before. Ain't no use calling out my name, girl, 'cause I can't hear you anymore. I'm a-thinking and a-wandering as I wander down the road. Once loved a woman, a child I am told. Alright. So it's been a couple of weeks since we did the original comparison between the AT2020 and the Yeti by Blue. I really felt like both mics did an excellent job of capturing acoustic guitar and the nuances of the voice. The Yeti had some features that I really felt were very beneficial. The zero latency monitoring, the ability to hear yourself as you sang. However, ultimately, upon critical listening to the two tracks, I felt like the AT2020 captured the top end with slightly more openness. Both mics were accurate in capturing the room, but the AT2020 allowed my voice to sound a little breathier, and more noticeably, the strings had what I would have called a little bit of glisten on them. That helped give the guitar an attractive sound that I felt that the Yeti lacked. Both mics, I feel, deserve 5 stars for doing an excellent job of capturing audio, putting it straight to a computer for a very modest price. Ultimately, I returned both mics because I wanted that openness in the AT2020, but I couldn't live without the features that were found on the Yeti, so I have spent the extra money to step up to the AT2020 Plus model. It has the headphone out, zero latency monitoring. I'm assuming that the audio that it captures is at least as good as the AT2020 base model. I'll play a little bit of the song so we can all do a comparison. Sit and wonder why, if and you don't know by now. And there ain't no use. Sit and wonder why that'd never do somehow. When your rooster crows crack of dawn, look out your window, honey baby, I'll be gone. You're the reason I'm a-traveling on. Don't think twice, it's alright. There ain't no calling out my name like you never done before. Ain't no use in calling out my name, sweet girl, for I can't hear you anymore.
Today I wanted to talk about a new microphone. I purchased this just today, the the Audio-Technica AT2020 USB Plus cardioide condenser microphone. It's USB driven. There's no interface needed between this mic and the computer. You just plug it into your USB inlet there. I'm using Audacity to record this, and the audio you're hearing is coming from this microphone. You can see the little blue light on in there that shows that that's the microphone recording this audio, because I wanted this video to include the high quality audio that I'm getting out of this microphone. I have to say, it's not very often I buy a piece of equipment where I feel motivated to do a review on it impromptu like this, but this is really good. I've been doing audio production for years now, and I'm used to using guys like this. This is a Neumann, and these are sort of $1,000 studio quality microphones, and this is what I purchased this one because it's very portable, it's very easy to set up. People are often asking me about doing setups for podcasting and so forth, so I'm doing this review partly for people who are interested in looking for a great podcasting mic, and I think I found it with this one, Audio-Technica AT2020 USB. Some lovely features on this. For a start, we've got it around the back here, and this is going to rumble because I'm recording this microphone, so it's going to rumble as I turn it, so as would be expected. I loosened it there. We've got a microphone outlet on the back. Let's zoom in just a touch on the actual mic here itself. Okay, so we've got a headphone outlet here, so you can plug your headphones in, and that is now giving me a live feed from the microphone into my cans here. And now around the front, if I turn that back, a bit more rumbling, not too bad. We've got a mic monitor mix there. All right, so I can turn the mic down and hear more of the monitoring and so on by rolling that back and forth. And I also have a headphone volume switch here as well. So very simple controls. It has a cardioid audio pattern. Okay, so it's picking up in this range. It is very sensitive. I've noticed I'm able to hear distant sounds in here. So it has a similar sensitivity to that which I find with the studio mics like the Neumanns. The frequency response sounds wonderful. I'm really enjoying this. It seems particularly good for vocals. I did try a guitar through it earlier, and many mics suffer from this problem, is that acoustic guitars put out too much bass. But as long as I positioned it right, I got a fairly good sound out of the guitar with this, even though it seems to be, to me, this is much more like the types of mics I would use for vocals. Okay, it really is delivering well above its price tag. It's got it's a large condenser in there. There's a large condenser plate in there. Okay, I'm recording this. You can see the laptop behind. This is the audio track you'll be hearing on the video once I've pulled all this together. So that you're hearing the microphone, not the microphones in the camera there. I wanted to make sure that you were hearing the microphone at all times, even if I'm further away from it. Now, some experiments I did do with this. I would use a pop guard normally, so let's just put a pop guard in front of that, like that, just to protect it from the P's and B's, and then you can get in really close without getting too much, air noise from speaking, but still get the proximity effect and the studio sound that you would get from a much more expensive mic normally. Also, the signal is beautifully clean. Absolute silence. I can't hear any hiss. What I can hear is the fan of this laptop running in the background, very slightly. But the mic itself is transparent. It's not putting any sound that I can hear anyway into the mix. So the quality is superb, and you really can get that broadcast sound if you use a pop screen and get in real close as I'm doing here. Some other nice things that came with this microphone that I really appreciated. Let's take that back off there, and that is, there's a nice little stand here, and I'll cut in some video showing this. But what happens is it screws in here. There's this fitting here This fitting here is designed for standard microphone stands, and I'm using it for my boom here. It came with this, so if you don't have any kind of a boom arm or a mic stand at this point, you could still get started with this microphone using this little stand here. Of course, its height doesn't adjust, but you know, you could, if you need it up near your mouth, you could stack it up on some books or something. And this is really well made, by the way. You've got an adjustment on here so we can change the angle. It's very well made. The only thing I found about this, first thing I did was mounted it on this. You actually have to have it, and I'll cut in some video showing you this, you actually have to have the weight over one of the legs, otherwise it tends to tip. So that's just the only minor criticism, but you're getting some terrific quality mic for, you know, this price break is just, it's crazy good. I'm really impressed with this. So I hope you'll find this review helpful, and the fact that we were recording the audio through it also helpful. And I would say happy podcasting, and definitely have this on your wish list for your next mic upgrade.
Hola amigos, quería mostraros este micrófono, el de Audio-Technica, el AT2020. Voy a hacer un pequeño unboxing y luego os comentaré por qué he elegido este micrófono y no otros que también hay en el mercado. Primero que nada, deciros que es un micrófono condensador, patrón cardioide. El rango de frecuencias del micro son 20 Hz a 20 kHz. El fabricante tiene la versión como esta USB, y hay otra versión que no es USB. El conversor analógico digital que lleva dentro, la tarjeta de sonido, nos permite por una parte conectarle auriculares y por otra parte permite 16 bits de resolución y una frecuencia de muestreo de 44.1 o 48 kHz. También tiene control mix para poder mezclar con audio pregrabado. Obviamente el micrófono es un señor micrófono. Lo que voy a hacer primero es un unboxing y luego os explico por qué he elegido este en vez de otra marca. Bueno, veis, tenemos aquí instrucciones, lo que es la garantía. Bueno, veis el micro como viene, dentro de esta forma precortada, ¿vale? Dentro de este plástico. Luego tenemos esta bolsa y ya está, no hay nada más. Bueno, dentro de la bolsa tenemos el cable USB, veis los dos conectores del USB, ¿vale? El cable USB 3 metros de largo. Tenemos este adaptador, aquí va el micro, ¿vale? Y esto pues iría a lo que es el pie de micro, ¿vale? Bueno, veis que lleva un adaptador de rosca también. Y luego tenemos un pequeño trípode para si lo vamos a usar encima de una mesa. Vale, pues ya tenemos el trípode. Bueno, os muestro el micro un poquito más de cerca. Bueno, podéis verlo. La verdad es que es un micro, una apariencia bastante chula. Desde aquí arriba hasta aquí abajo son 15 centímetros y medio, más o menos. Y desde aquí arriba hasta lo que sería la parte del micro son 13 centímetros. Bueno, veis que aquí delante lleva lo que es, bueno, la parte delantera obviamente es donde está la marca. La parte trasera se indica con un back. En la parte delantera tenemos el nivel de control de mix, ya sea escuchar lo que es el micrófono o escuchar lo que es el audio que tengamos pregrabado en el ordenador. El volumen de los auriculares. Y luego aquí tenemos la entrada jack para los auriculares. Bueno, lo muestro un poquito más de cerca. En el aspecto estético también me gusta, ¿eh? Es bastante majo. Bueno, veis aquí el marco del USB. Por aquí entra el USB. Bueno, veis que aquí abajo tiene la rosca. Bueno, sistema de rosca, pues, simplemente enroscarlo. Vale, bueno, veis cómo queda. Bueno, lo voy a colocar en este caso en un escudo, no lo voy a colocar en un pie de micro. Y así también os muestro enchufado pues el LED y os comento pues si ha habido algún problema en la instalación, si se instalan los drivers y todo esto automáticamente. Vale, venga, vamos allá. Bueno, aquí estoy con el micro, lo he puesto ya en el escudo para probarlo, lo he estado usando. Y bueno, más que nada os quería mostrar el tema del LED. Otra cosa que me ha gustado mucho sobre la entrada jack es que está muy fácil de localizar porque la tenemos aquí, ¿vale? Entonces prácticamente sin mirar la he enchufado, ¿veis? Bueno, la idea es que está prácticamente en un lateral y entonces es más fácil de conectar. También el patrón del micrófono es cardioide, Por lo tanto, tenemos que estar delante del micro para que nos escuche. Bueno, lo que es la rosca, como veis, nos permite ajustar el micro con bastante facilidad. Yo veo que luego la rosca aprietas y se queda el micro perfectamente pillado. Vale, bueno, y dicho esto sobre el pie, sí que me gustaría comentaros, sí que me gustaría comentaros por qué la Audio-Technica 2020 y no otro micro. Obviamente, cuando estamos hablando de un micrófono ya un poquito bueno, igual va a gastarse 130 que 150. Entonces, ¿yo por qué he cogido este 2020? Pues básicamente porque es el que me han recomendado. ¿Qué ventaja tiene este micro sobre otros de calidad parecida? Pues que a veces más no es mejor. Quiero decir, hay otros micros de su rango de precio que tienen una sensibilidad brutal, de tal manera que si pasa una mosca por detrás, pues capta el sonido de la mosca. ¿Y cuál es el problema? El problema está que si estamos en nuestra casa, en nuestro estudio casero, pues todo eso son cosas que tenemos que limpiar. A menos que estemos en una whisper room, que tengamos una habitación bien acolchada, entonces estaríamos hablando de otro tema, ¿no? Pero para mucha gente que es unos medios precarios para grabar, pues obviamente un micrófono que sea un pelín menos sensible, pero que al mismo tiempo tenga una calidad de sonido excepcional, pues esto nos va a permitir que no tengamos que limpiar luego tanto sonido, ¿vale? Esta es la idea detrás de este micro. Vale, pues nada, espero haberos ayudado a mostraroslo y hasta otra.
What's going on, guys? Kaiser here, and today we'll be taking a look at what I think is one of the best mics under $100, the Audio-Technica AT2020. I'll also be comparing it to one of the first mics that I used on the channel, the Blue Yeti, and the mic that I'm currently using, the Audio-Technica AT4040. With that said, let's get to it. This is the Audio-Technica AT2020, a $99 cardioide condenser XLR microphone. This mic has a frequency response of 20 to 20,000 hertz, an impedance of 100 ohms, and requires 48 volts of phantom power. Inside the box, you get this cool leatherette carrying bag, an adapter for mounting, and the mic. Now, just like the AT4040, this mic is made of metal and has a really solid build, and that's one of the things that attracted me to Audio-Technica. Their mics have a really premium look and feel. Now, this mic weighs in at 339 grams, so unlike the Blue Yeti, it's not so heavy that it causes my boom arm to drift down. In comparison to the AT4040, it is a tad bit shorter, and it doesn't have a low cut switch or a negative dB pad, but it still retains its large diaphragm. Now, it does have a cardioid polar pattern, so it will reduce some pickup of sound from the rear and the sides, but it's still a condenser mic, so it's really sensitive to sound. Here's how it sounds with me talking and typing on some mechanical blue switches. Now, if you don't have an interface already, you're going to need one with this mic. You can get this one in a bundle along with the AT2020 for $149. However, you'll still need to pick up an XLR cable and a stand. Alright, so now I'm going to let you hear some unprocessed and processed audio from these mics. I'll be using the Behringer UM2 interface with the AT2020 and the 4040. Now, of course, the Blue Yeti is a plug-and-play USB mic, so it doesn't require phantom power. So I'll be connecting it directly to my iMac. Now, I'd recommend listening to this audio with headphones on so you can better hear the difference. What you're listening to now is unprocessed audio from the Blue Yeti. What you're listening to now is unprocessed audio from the Audio-Technica AT4040. What you're listening to now is unprocessed audio from the Audio-Technica AT2020. What you're listening to now is post-processed audio from the Blue Yeti. What you're listening to now is processed audio from the Audio-Technica AT4040. What you're listening to now is post-processed audio from the Audio-Technica AT2020. Now, sound is subjective, and everyone has their own specific type of sound that they like. And to me, the Yeti sounds really hollow and thin compared to the AT2020. Now, that's not a big surprise because an XLR mic should sound better than a USB mic, but this only becomes a problem when the USB mic, which is $130, is only $30 cheaper than the AT2020 bundle with an XLR cable. So then you have to ask yourself, is this mic $30 better than the Yeti? And in my opinion, it definitely is. Now, I added the $300 AT4040 in the mix simply as a reference to see how good the AT2020 is. And although the 4040 is a bit warmer, smoother, and has better dynamic range, the two sound fairly similar. Now, you could argue that the AT4040 doesn't sound $200 better than the AT2020, and I'd agree, only if you're using it for YouTube. But if you're doing any professional work such as voiceovers or music, that's when you really start to hear and appreciate the difference. But for YouTube, the AT2020 is more than capable. It's the perfect balance of price and performance, and definitely worth adding to your setup if you're looking to take your audio to the next level.
So I've been using this AT2020 microphone for a couple years now, and I do have to say it is my favorite microphone that I've used. I've had Blue Yetis, I've had other condenser mics, I've had microphones that just hook up to my headphones, and this is just my favorite one. If you are going to get this, this is the setup that I would recommend. I would get a shock mount that goes onto a Rode arm. This is an Amazon Basic XLR cable hooked up to a Focusrite, and then you just hook this up to your computer and run a software like Voicemeeter Potato, something like that, and you'll have the best sounding microphone. I promise you, this thing is great. Definitely pick this up if you're a streamer or if you just want a nice sounding mic to play video games on.
Wings of magic soaring, floating quiet breeze. Blue, the shade of freedom lifts above the trees, and all the thoughts below just gently slip away. A cruise on velvet skies, a meditative day.
Está todo rayado, raspado. Venía sin ningún sello, no tiene ningún sello, se nota que ya fue abierto. Al parecer, pareciese que el producto está en buen estado, pero sí hay varios detalles. No viene ni sellado, ni cubierto, ni protegido, sin etiquetas. Pareciera que no viene de Amazon.
Este ajustador ya está todo lo máximo y aún así se sale. Oh.